When people search for answers about narcissistic abuse, emotional manipulation, trauma bonding, or how a narcissist controls your mind, what they are often trying to name is not just conflict, selfishness, or a difficult relationship. They are trying to describe a psychological takeover that is subtle at first, confusing in the middle, and devastating by the end. The experience can feel like losing access to your own interior life. Your thoughts become crowded with the narcissist's needs, moods, reactions, grievances, and demands. Your emotional energy gets rerouted towards stabilizing someone whose inner world seems bottomless, volatile, and strangely hungry. Over time, your peace erodes, your instincts blur, and your sense of self becomes occupied territory. That is why the metaphor of mental colonization is so accurate. A narcissist does not merely ask for love, attention, patience, or forgiveness. In many cases, they conscript your empathy into serving as an external life support system for their fragile and empty inner world. They weaponize your conscience, recruit your compassion, and train your nervous system to organize around their psychological survival. If you have ever wondered why you could understand exactly how harmful they were and still feel unable to mentally leave them, the answer often lies here. Narcissists survive emotional vacuity by colonizing the minds of others. To understand this process, it helps to begin with what emotional vacuity actually means in this context. It does not mean that every narcissistic person feels nothing. In fact, many narcissists feel intensely, but their emotional life is unstable, underdeveloped, deeply defended, and profoundly self-referential. Their inner world often contains a painful mixture of shame, envy, emptiness, rage, insecurity, and grandiosity. Rather than metabolizing these feelings in a mature way, they typically rely on primitive defenses to avoid collapse. They deny weakness, project shame, externalize blame, and seek constant validation to keep a coherent image of themselves intact. Their need is not simply for affection, it is for psychic stabilization. They need other people to reflect back a version of reality in which they remain superior, innocent, desired, central, and exempt from accountability. When that mirror fails, when another person introduces boundaries, independent needs, competing perspectives, or inconvenient truths, the narcissist can experience that as a threat not just to ego but to psychic survival. What follows is often not ordinary disagreement but a campaign to restore dominance over the shared reality. This is where empathy becomes the entry point. Empathy is one of the most beautiful human capacities. It allows us to imagine another person's pain, respond with care, and remain relational even during conflict. But empathy without boundaries can be exploited. A narcissist quickly learns who can be emotionally recruited. They are often drawn to people who are conscientious, reflective, forgiving, trauma-informed, spiritually inclined, loyal, self-questioning, or deeply invested in repairing relationships. These are not weaknesses in themselves. They are strengths. But in the presence of narcissistic manipulation, those strengths can become openings through which colonization occurs. The narcissist detects your willingness to understand complexity and turns it into a mechanism of self-erasure. They present themselves as misunderstood, wounded, stressed, triggered, abandoned, or unfairly judged, and because you possess empathy, you begin by trying to understand. You listen longer. You excuse more. You investigate your own role. You search for the childhood wound behind the cruelty. You tell yourself that compassion can heal what criticism cannot. Before long, your empathy is no longer functioning as a bridge between two adults. It has been captured and repurposed into a tool for managing someone else's unprocessed emotional debris. One of the defining features of narcissistic colonization is outsourced emotional regulation. A psychologically mature person can feel disappointment, frustration, shame, fear, or jealousy without requiring another human being to dissolve themselves in order to contain it. They may seek support, but they remain responsible for their own internal states. A narcissist, by contrast, often treats other people as emotional processors. They discharge uncomfortable feelings into the relationship and then pressure the other person to carry them. If they feel ashamed, you are cast as cruel, judgmental, or impossible to please. If they feel guilty, they reframe events until you become the offender. If they feel inferior, they belittle you until you feel small instead. If they feel empty, they demand attention, admiration, sexual access, endless reassurance, or emotional labor to fill the void. If they feel rage, they provoke confusion and then insist that your reaction proves you are unstable. This is not random. It is a deeply patterned way of evading self-contact. They survive by exporting what they cannot bear to experience within themselves. That is why survivors of narcissistic abuse often describe carrying emotions that do not feel fully theirs. They feel chronically guilty without a clear reason. They feel ashamed after expressing ordinary needs. They feel selfish for resting, cruel for telling the truth, disloyal for having boundaries, and anxious for not preemptively fixing another person's mood. They become haunted by a sense of obligation that exceeds the actual facts of the relationship. This is the psychological occupation at work. The narcissist does not merely manipulate behavior, they infiltrate interpretation. They seek to become the authority inside your head, the voice that tells you what is acceptable, what is loving, what is selfish, what is abusive, what is real, and what you owe. Once that authority is internalized, the colonization can continue even in their physical absence. You are no longer simply dealing with a difficult person. You are living with an implanted regulator that monitors your thoughts on their behalf. The process usually begins long before the target recognizes it. In the early stage, the narcissist often creates a compelling emotional atmosphere. This can take the form of love bombing, intense mirroring, rapid intimacy, exceptional attentiveness, or a sense of uncanny connection. You may feel seen in a way that seems rare and profound. They may reflect your values, admire your strengths, disclose pain early, and position the relationship as unusually deep, fated, or transformative. In some cases they cast themselves as the only one who truly understands you, in others, they portray you as the only one who has ever truly understood them. Both narratives create an exclusive emotional bond. This is not just romantic strategy. It is infrastructure. The narcissist is building a corridor into your mind through idealization. By making themselves emotionally central very quickly, they increase the likelihood that you will interpret later harm through the lens of initial intimacy. You will not simply see manipulation. You will see a wounded person who was once tender, and you will work harder to recover that version. Once attachment is secured, the colonization deepens through destabilization. The narcissist introduces inconsistency, but not so abruptly that you leave immediately. They alternate warmth and withdrawal, praise and contempt, vulnerability and attack, pursuit and indifference. This intermittent reinforcement is psychologically powerful because it binds attention to unpredictability. Your brain begins scanning for clues, trying to regain equilibrium, replaying conversations, adjusting behavior, and searching for the hidden rule that will restore the connection. The relationship becomes mentally consuming not only because it matters to you, but because it never fully settles. The narcissist benefits from this state. A preoccupied mind is easier to occupy. When your inner resources are spent tracking their moods, defending your innocence, and trying to solve the unsolvable, you have less access to your own reality. Gaslighting is one of the most efficient tools in this occupation. Many people think of gaslighting as obvious denial of objective facts, but in narcissistic relationships it is often more sophisticated. The narcissist may not say "that never happened" in a crude way. Instead, they may revise tone, intention, context, sequence, and meaning until you become uncertain about what you experienced. They may say you are too sensitive, misremembering, projecting, exaggerating, or taking things out of context. They may insist they were joking, that you made them act that way, that anyone else would agree with them, or that your concerns are evidence of trauma, insecurity, or instability. They may use half-truths, selective memory, semantic loopholes, spiritual language, therapeutic jargon, or social charm to make their version of events seem more credible. The goal is not merely to win an argument. The goal is to weaken your confidence in your own mind. When that happens repeatedly, your internal witness becomes less authoritative. You begin consulting the narcissist's interpretation before trusting your own. Projection plays a central role here. A narcissist often accuses others of the very qualities or behaviors they cannot tolerate in themselves. They call you controlling while controlling the emotional climate. They call you selfish while monopolizing care. They call you abusive while engaging in covert cruelty. They call you unstable while manufacturing chaos. They call you dishonest while manipulating reality. Projection is not just hypocrisy. It is a mechanism of transfer. The narcissist relocates disowned shame into another person and then attacks it there. If you are empathic and self-reflective, you may take the accusation seriously. You may comb through your motives, looking for the grain of truth that proves you are fair. That instinct, admirable in healthy relationships, becomes dangerous in abusive ones. Because while you are examining yourself in good faith, the narcissist is using your introspection as a dumping ground. Their shame enters your mind disguised as self-improvement. This is why narcissistic abuse often feels spiritually and psychologically exhausting in a way that is hard to explain to outsiders. The issue is not only what happened. It is what happened to your attention. Your mind ceased to belong primarily to you. It became organized around anticipation, management, translation, de-escalation, and repair. You began waking up with them in your thoughts and going to sleep reviewing what you should have said differently. You rehearsed conversations, policed your tone, edited your needs, softened your boundaries, and monitored your face, body, timing, and words to prevent backlash. You became, in effect, a satellite nervous system orbiting their emotional weather. That is colonization. It is not always loud. Sometimes it appears as chronic mental occupation by someone who has trained you to treat their dysregulation as your responsibility. Many narcissists also exploit moral asymmetry. They rely on the fact that you have a conscience and they are willing to manipulate it. Healthy people tend to assume a basic reciprocity in conflict. If they care about being fair, they assume the other person does too. If they are distressed by hurting someone, they assume the other person has at least some similar discomfort. But narcissistic dynamics are often asymmetrical. Your concern for truth, repair, and mutuality can be used against you by someone whose primary goal is image management, dominance, supply, or escape from shame. You may come to conversations prepared to understand both sides, only to find that your openness is harvested while theirs remains performative. You offer accountability, they offer deflection. You bring nuance, they use distortion. You reveal vulnerability, they weaponize it later. You apologize sincerely, they store your apology as evidence that you are the problem. Because you are playing by relational rules and they are playing by survival rules, you remain one move behind. The narcissist does not need you to be perfect. They need you to remain ethically available while they remain psychologically unbound. Another way narcissists colonize the mind is by manufacturing a false center of gravity. In healthy intimacy, each person has a separate subjectivity. There is room for two realities, two needs, two histories, and two emotional worlds. In narcissistic relating, that plurality collapses. Everything rotates around the narcissist state. If you are happy, they may redirect attention toward themselves. If you are grieving, they may compete, withdraw, or become offended that your attention has shifted. If you set a boundary, the conversation suddenly becomes about how hurt they are. If they betray you, the aftermath becomes about their stress, your tone, their triggers, your forgiveness, their reputation, and the unbearable burden of being held accountable. Even your pain gets processed through their ego. This creates a relational universe in which your inner life is continuously subordinated. Eventually you may stop bringing yourself fully into the relationship because there is no real room for you there. This self-silencing is often mistaken for peace, maturity, or compassion when it is actually the result of occupation. Narcissists are also highly skilled at attaching themselves to your deepest values. They do not merely demand compliance, they seek legitimacy inside your moral framework. If you value loyalty, they frame leaving as betrayal. If you value compassion, they frame boundaries as cruelty. If you value honesty, they provoke confessions and then use them selectively. If you value family, they invoke duty. If you value healing, they accuse you of not being evolved enough to understand them. If you value faith, they quote forgiveness while ignoring repentance. If you value justice, they cast themselves as victims. This is one reason survivors often stay longer than outsiders think they should. They are not simply attached to the person. They are entangled through their own principles. The narcissist has nested inside their ethics. The very things that make you decent become the levers by which your autonomy is compromised. Shame is the hidden currency in this system. Narcissists often carry enormous shame, but because shame threatens the grandiose self-image, it must be disowned, disguised, or expelled. Rather than feeling small, they induce smallness in others. Rather than facing inadequacy, they create inadequacy around themselves. Rather than metabolizing guilt, they externalize fault. This is why being close to a narcissist can produce a persistent feeling of not enoughness. You never fully arrive at safety because the system depends on your destabilization. If you become too grounded, too clear, too self-respecting, too independent, or too well-supported, you are harder to colonize. So the narcissist punctures your confidence through criticism, comparison, triangulation, contradiction, subtle contempt, withheld approval, impossible standards, and moving goalposts. Nothing is ever quite settled because settlement would allow you to return home to yourself. Triangulation deserves special attention because it expands the colonization beyond the dyad. A narcissist often introduces real or imagined third parties to regulate your behavior and amplify self-doubt. They compare you to an ex, a sibling, a coworker, a friend, or an idealized stranger. They hint that others agree with them. They share selective stories that make you feel deficient or replaceable. They flirt with alternatives, invoke rivals, or recruit flying monkeys who echo their narrative. This tactic does more than create jealousy or insecurity. It colonizes the social dimension of your mind. Now you are not only contending with the narcissist's version of reality, but with a phantom audience. You begin imagining how others see you, what they have been told, whether your reputation is being managed behind your back. Your mental world becomes populated with invisible judges whose presence was installed by the narcissist. Again, your attention is no longer free. The body plays a profound role in this occupation. Long before the conscious mind names abuse, the nervous system often registers it. You may notice dread before seeing their name on your phone, hypervigilance around their tone, exhaustion after contact, difficulty concentrating, insomnia, stomach tension, headaches, a racing heart, or a collapse of energy after conflict. This is not weakness. It is embodied intelligence. The body knows when the mind is being coerced into chronic self-betrayal. Yet narcissists frequently teach their targets to override these signals. They frame your stress response as overreaction, your intuition as paranoia, your fatigue as irresponsibility, and your emotional pain as evidence that you are defective. In doing so, they sever the alliance between your body and your mind, which is one of the most powerful steps in colonization. A person who distrusts their own felt sense is easier to govern from the outside. What makes this especially devastating is that many survivors are not naive. They may be intelligent, professionally accomplished, psychologically literate, and deeply perceptive. Colonization does not require stupidity. It requires sustained exposure to distortion under conditions of attachment. When someone you care about repeatedly reframes reality, alternates tenderness with punishment, and bind your conscience to their comfort, the mind adapts. It starts optimizing for survival within the relationship. You become brilliant at reading subtext, predicting moods, and minimizing conflict, while simultaneously losing contact with simpler truths such as "this hurts," "this is unfair," "I am allowed to leave," and "someone else's shame is not mine to carry." In this way, high sensitivity and intelligence can actually intensify the trap, because the survivor can generate endless explanations for behavior that should simply be recognized as harmful. Narcissists often create what feels like a closed psychological ecosystem. Information from outside sources is discredited. Friends who challenge the dynamic are labeled jealous, negative, manipulative, uninformed, or against the relationship. Therapists may be portrayed as biased. Family members become threats. Independent perspectives are framed as contamination. The narcissist wants interpretive monopoly. If they can isolate you from external reality checks, their version of events becomes harder to contest. Even when they do not physically isolate you, they may mentally isolate you by making you feel that no one else could possibly understand the complexity, history, or intensity of the bond. This deepens your dependency on the very person who is harming you. Like all colonizing structures, the system protects itself by narrowing the channels through which resistance can emerge. One of the cruelest aspects of narcissistic colonization is that the victim often participates in it without realizing it, not because they consent to abuse, but because attachment and hope keep them invested in repair. They over-explain their feelings. They offer endless chances. They produce evidence. They write long messages trying to restore shared reality. They absorb blame to preserve connection. They focus on being kinder, clearer, calmer, more patient, more understanding, less reactive, less demanding. Each effort is understandable. Each effort makes sense inside the logic of love. But in a narcissistic system, these repair attempts are frequently exploited as signs that you are still available for occupation. Your willingness to understand becomes a renewable resource. Trauma bonding intensifies this cycle. Trauma bonds are not evidence of true compatibility, they are attachments forged through intermittent reward and punishment. The nervous system becomes conditioned to seek relief from the same source that causes distress. The narcissist wounds, then soothes, destabilizes, then reconnects, devalues, then briefly restores intimacy. This creates a powerful loop in which hope, fear, longing, and relief become fused. The target may interpret the intensity as love, depth, destiny, or unfinished healing, when in fact it is often a neurobiological trap. The mind becomes fixated on regaining the high of the idealization phase while minimizing the brutality of the devaluation phase. In colonization terms, trauma bonding is one of the mechanisms that keeps the occupied population emotionally invested in the occupier. There is also often a fantasy component that binds survivors to the dynamic. The fantasy may be that love will heal the narcissist, that enough patience will unlock their hidden tenderness, that the abuse is merely a reaction to stress, that insight will create change, that your exceptional devotion will be rewarded, or that the early version of them was the real one and the current cruelty is temporary. These fantasies are not foolish, they are often shaped by the narcissist's own periodic vulnerability and by the target's profound capacity for hope. But they keep the mind oriented toward potential rather than pattern. Colonization thrives in that gap. As long as you are relating to who they could be, you remain vulnerable to what they repeatedly are. The narcissist's relationship to accountability reveals the core of the system. Genuine accountability requires tolerating shame without evacuating it into someone else. It requires acknowledging impact, making repair, surrendering control over how one is perceived, and enduring the discomfort of being imperfect. This is precisely what many narcissists are structured to avoid. Instead, they may perform accountability cosmetically while continuing the same underlying behaviors. They apologize without specifics, cry without changing, agree in language while retaliating in tone, attend therapy as image management, or adopt the language of healing without relinquishing entitlement. The target, hungry for resolution, may mistake verbal recognition for transformation. But colonization ends not when the narcissist says the right words, but when you stop handing over authorship of your reality. The aftermath of narcissistic colonization often confuses survivors because the mind remains occupied long after the relationship changes or ends. You may continue hearing their criticisms in your head. You may still argue with them mentally, defend yourself in imaginary conversations, feel guilty for things you no longer rationally believe were wrong, or struggle to make simple decisions without anticipating their reaction. This is not because you are broken. It is because repeated coercive dynamics install internal structures. The narcissist becomes an internalized judge, interpreter, and regulator. Recovery, therefore, is not merely emotional detachment from a person. It is decolonization of the inner world. It is the slow dismantling of a foreign authority that has taken up residence in your thoughts, body, language, and self-concept. Decolonization begins with naming. Language interrupts confusion. When you understand that what happened was not just a series of misunderstandings but a pattern of emotional outsourcing, projection, gaslighting, shame transfer, and control, your experience begins to organize. The fog starts lifting. You stop asking only "why was I not enough?" and begin asking "why was I carrying what never belonged to me?" This shift is foundational. Colonization depends on misattribution. It depends on your assumption that the emotional burden you feel is proof of your failure rather than evidence of what has been deposited into you. When you start recognizing that much of your guilt, confusion, and chronic self-doubt was induced rather than earned, the system loses one of its strongest anchors. Another essential part of reclaiming your mental landscape is differentiating empathy from self-abandonment. Empathy does not require you to become a landfill for another person's unresolved shame. Compassion does not demand perpetual access. Understanding someone's wound does not obligate you to remain where you are being harmed. You can recognize that a narcissist is deeply defended, emotionally immature, traumatized, or empty without assigning yourself the job of compensating for those deficits. This is one of the hardest truths for caring people to accept because it feels morally uncomfortable at first. But the discomfort is often a sign that your boundaries are reawakening, not that you are becoming cold. Boundaries are not merely behavioral lines around time, contact, money, or communication. In decolonization, boundaries are also cognitive and emotional. They involve refusing false responsibility, declining to over-explain what is already clear, disengaging from circular arguments, resisting invitations to self-betrayal, and preserving your right to interpret your own experience. A boundary may sound like "I am not discussing this further," but it may also sound internally like "their accusation does not automatically define me, their mood is not my emergency, I do not need their agreement to trust what happened," or "I can leave the conversation even if they remain dissatisfied." These inner boundaries matter because narcissistic colonization often survives through mental obedience long after physical exposure decreases. No contact and low contact strategies can be powerful in this regard, not because silence is magical, but because reducing access limits fresh deposits of distortion. If the narcissist continues to reach you through calls, texts, social media, triangulation, or sudden vulnerability, your mind remains vulnerable to reoccupation. Every interaction becomes a chance for them to reassert narrative control, provoke guilt, harvest attention, or test whether their old access point still exists. In some situations, full no contact is not possible, especially with co-parenting, family ties, or work entanglements. Even then, emotional detachment and highly structured communication can reduce penetration. The aim is not punishment. The aim is sovereignty. Grief is unavoidable in recovery. Many survivors think they need certainty, anger, or evidence to leave psychologically, but often what they really need is permission to grieve. You may need to grieve not only the person, but the hope, the fantasy, the years lost to confusion, the version of yourself that kept trying, the innocence that assumed love would be met with care, and the reality that there may never be a satisfying explanation. Narcissistic abuse is especially painful because it injures both trust and meaning. The target often cannot find closure through dialogue because the very person who caused the fracture depends on preserving distortion. Grief becomes the bridge where explanation fails. It allows you to stop circling for an answer that the narcissist is structurally unable or unwilling to provide. Rebuilding self-trust is the heart of decolonization. Self-trust is not arrogance or certainty about everything. It is the quiet capacity to take your own perceptions seriously. It is the ability to register discomfort without immediately overriding it, to honor your fatigue, to notice contradiction, to believe your body, to respect your no, and to stop requiring external permission for internally verifiable truths. This often develops slowly. At first you may still second-guess yourself constantly. You may worry that you are becoming unfair, rigid, or unloving. That fear is common because the colonized mind has been trained to equate self-protection with moral failure. But every time you notice a pattern and do not explain it away, every time you feel guilt and do not automatically obey it, every time you choose clarity over chemistry, you are reclaiming territory. Supportive relationships are crucial because colonization often thrives in secrecy and confusion. Being around people who do not require self-erasure can feel almost disorienting at first. You may be suspicious of calm, uncomfortable with kindness, or uncertain how to receive consistent care. That is normal. A nervous system trained in volatility often misreads peace as boredom and intensity as depth. Healthy connection re-educates your system gradually. It shows you that intimacy does not require hypervigilance, that disagreement does not equal annihilation, that care can be reciprocal, and that your interior life does not need to be edited for someone else's comfort. Trusted friends, support groups, trauma-informed therapists, and communities that validate coercive abuse dynamics can all help restore an external course of reality until your own inner witness strengthens again. It is also important to understand why knowledge alone does not instantly free the occupied mind. Many survivors can explain narcissistic abuse with remarkable accuracy and still feel emotionally hooked. Insight is necessary but not sufficient because colonization lives in the body, the attachment system, the conscience, and the habits of thought. You may know they are manipulative and still miss them. You may understand projection and still feel ashamed. You may see the pattern and still crave the apology. None of this means the analysis is wrong. It means recovery is layered. Cognitive clarity opens the door, but repetition, grieving, somatic regulation, and relational repair are often needed before the inner atmosphere fully changes. One common obstacle in recovery is the tendency to focus exclusively on diagnosing the narcissist. While understanding narcissistic traits, narcissistic abuse, and covert manipulation can be useful, there comes a point when endless analysis becomes another form of occupation. Your mind remains centered on them, their motives, their childhood, their lies, their new supply, their pathology, their image, their future collapse, their possible awakening. This is understandable, especially after severe gaslighting, because the mind wants coherence. But decolonization requires a gradual shift from "who are they really?" to "what happened to me in their presence?" and eventually to "what do I need now to feel safe, whole, and free?" The goal is not to understand them perfectly. The goal is to recover yourself. Another subtle but powerful step is returning stolen language to its rightful place. Narcissists often hijack words like love, respect, honesty, loyalty, communication, healing, and abuse. They redefine these terms to preserve control. Love becomes tolerance of mistreatment. Respect becomes obedience. Honesty becomes forced disclosure from you while they remain opaque. Loyalty becomes endurance without reciprocity. Communication becomes endless access to your emotional labor. Healing becomes waiting for them indefinitely. Abuse becomes your reaction to their provocation. Decolonization means restoring the integrity of language. Love does not require self-annihilation. Respect is mutual. Honesty includes accountability. Loyalty cannot be built on coercion. Communication is not submission. Healing is not a hostage situation. Abuse is not your boundary. There is often a turning point in recovery when the survivor realizes that the narcissist never actually had the godlike authority their mind granted them. They had leverage, access, and psychological influence, yes, but much of their power came from implanted significance. They became central because the system trained you to treat them as central. Their judgments felt definitive because repetition and attachment amplified them. Their approval felt life-giving because deprivation made crumbs feel precious. Their rejection felt annihilating because trauma bonding fused connection with survival. As this spell weakens, the narcissist can begin to look less like an omnipotent force and more like what they often are, a deeply defended person whose inability to face their own emptiness led them to invade the psyches of others. That recognition is not about superiority. It is about scale. Colonization enlarges the colonizer in your mind and shrinks you in your own. Recovery reverses that distortion. You begin to see that your empathy was never the problem, its capture was. Your sensitivity was never a defect, it was exploited. Your longing for repair was never foolish, it was used against you. Your confusion was not evidence of weakness, it was the predictable result of sustained contradiction. Your body's distress was not irrational, it was a map. Your anger was not the failure of your compassion, it was the immune system of your psyche trying to defend what was still yours. For many survivors, one of the hardest pieces to accept is that the narcissist often knew enough. They may not have had full reflective insight into every defense, but they usually knew when they were pushing your limits, twisting the story, punishing independence, or demanding care they would not reciprocate. Survivors sometimes cling to the belief that if only the narcissist fully understood the pain they caused, they would change. But people who consistently rely on externalizing shame often resist understanding impact precisely because impact threatens their self-structure. Waiting for them to become the witness you needed can prolong occupation. Healing often accelerates when you stop seeking recognition from the source of distortion and begin offering recognition to yourself. Self-recognition is revolutionary after narcissistic abuse. It means saying, perhaps for the first time with conviction, I was there. I know what happened. I know what it cost me. I know how often I tried. I know how much I carried. I know the shape of the confusion. I know the shrinking. I know the way my body braced. I know the negotiations I made against myself. I know how I disappeared. And I also know that I am still here. These statements may seem simple, but they restore authorship. Colonization depends on the erasure of the native voice. Recovery begins when that voice returns, even in a whisper. From an SEO perspective, people often ask, how do narcissists control your mind? Why is it so hard to leave a narcissist? What is narcissistic abuse? What is gaslighting? Why do I feel guilty after setting boundaries? How do narcissists use empathy against you? And how do you heal after narcissistic abuse? The answer weaving through all of these questions is that narcissistic control is rarely just about overt domination. It is about psychological occupation. It is about inserting their needs into your conscience, their shame into your body, their narrative into your memory, and their instability into your nervous system. It is about turning your own gifts against you until you begin collaborating in your diminishment. And healing is the inverse process, naming the occupation, interrupting the access, grieving the bond, reclaiming interpretation, strengthening boundaries, trusting embodied truth, and building a life in which your mind is no longer annexed by someone else's void. A reclaimed mind feels different. It is quieter. It has more room. Decisions become less haunted. Your inner dialogue becomes less prosecutorial and more humane. You notice that you can have a thought without immediately imagining their rebuttal. You can rest without feeling you have abandoned someone. You can disappoint others without collapsing into shame. You can detect guilt as a feeling rather than a verdict. You can love people without merging with them. You can offer empathy without surrendering authorship. You can walk away from emotional chaos without feeling compelled to decode it. You become less available for psychic occupation because you are more fully inhabiting your own territory. That does not mean you become hard, suspicious, or incapable of intimacy. In fact, true decolonization often restores the possibility of real connection because it untangles love from enmeshment and care from coercion. You begin to recognize that the deepest intimacy is not built by rescuing someone from their internal void or sacrificing your mind to stabilize their ego. It is built by mutual presence, accountability, reciprocity, emotional responsibility, and respect for separateness. Healthy love does not colonize. It does not require you to host another person's shame, deny your body, or abandon your perception to preserve the bond. It invites you to become more yourself, not less. If you are emerging from the aftermath of a narcissistic relationship, it may help to remember that occupation can feel total while it is happening, but no occupation is the same as identity. The fact that your thoughts were once crowded by someone else does not mean they own your mind forever. The fact that you carried their projections does not mean they are the truth of who you are. The fact that you adapted to survive does not mean adaptation is your destiny. What was colonized can be reclaimed. What was silenced can speak again. What was trained into guilt can learn freedom. What was organized around another person's emptiness can reorganize around your own life. And that is the deepest reversal of all. The narcissist colonizes because they are estranged from genuine inner abundance. They survive by extracting vitality from others. But when you reclaim your mental landscape, you step out of extraction and back into authorship. You stop serving as an emotional colony for someone else's unprocessed shame. You stop mistaking depletion for devotion. You stop confusing hypervigilance with love. You stop lending sacred authority to a voice that only grew loud because it was repeated in conditions of attachment and fear. You recover the right to feel what you feel, know what you know, refuse what harms you, and protect what is yours. In the end, the greatest threat to narcissistic influence is not your anger, your explanations, your superior arguments, or your ability to diagnose them flawlessly. It is your return to yourself. It is your decision to become uninterpretable by their distortions. It is your refusal to host what they cannot bear to feel. It is your willingness to let them remain unresolved while you become clear. It is your recognition that empathy is a gift, not a public utility for the emotionally predatory. It is your commitment to preserving your mind as a homeland rather than an occupied zone. Once that shift begins, the entire mechanism weakens. Their hooks have less to grab. Their guilt has less to feed on. Their narrative has less authority. Their emptiness is returned to its owner. You do not heal by becoming someone who never cared. You heal by becoming someone whose care is no longer exploitable. You do not heal by proving the narcissist wrong in every forum. You heal by refusing to let their distortions remain the organizing principle of your inner life. You do not heal by erasing what happened. You heal by integrating it so thoroughly that it no longer governs you from the shadows. You become a person who can look back and say, "They once colonized my mind because I mistook my empathy for an endless obligation, my guilt for truth, my confusion for complexity, and my loyalty for love. But their survival strategy is no longer my home. My mind is my own again."